The world had fallen quietly. It was not the loud, explosive end that anyone had imagined, with firestorms or dramatic battles on every continent. No, it had been slow. Too slow, perhaps, for anyone to notice in time. Cities once alive with movement, and sound now lay in silent ruin. Streets were cracked, buildings crumbled, and vines crept through broken windows. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In the north, where forests had overtaken what used to be bustling towns, the last humans had tried to survive. They hid in underground shelters, in old bunkers built decades before. These shelters were the only places that still held electricity and running water, though even that was limited. The people inside knew they were running out of time. Supplies were low. The temperature above ground had begun to change drastically. Storms that came without warning made even small excursions dangerous. Every day was a struggle to find something, anything, that could keep them alive a little longer. Inside one of these underground shelters, a small group of scientists and engineers worked tirelessly. They were tired, their eyes heavy from long nights with little sleep, but they continued because they had to. They had convinced themselves that somehow, some way, they could save humanity. They studied the climate, monitored failing satellites, and tried to communicate with anyone, anywhere. But as the months passed, the silence grew. Radio transmissions bounced back empty, and satellite feeds showed nothing but abandoned cities and deserts spreading across the land. Even though the people in the bunker knew the world outside was dying, they held on to hope. Hope was all they had left. Some of them worked on experimental machines designed to clean water or grow food faster. Others tried to develop medicines that could prevent the final outbreaks of disease from wiping out what was left of humanity. They were desperate, but they refused to give up. Giving up was not an option, even though they feared the worst. One day, as the scientists monitored their equipment, a chill ran through the bunker. The systems that had been quietly humming for decades began to show strange readings. Sensors, meant to detect human life around the world, suddenly went silent. At first, they thought it was a glitch. Computers fail. Sensors break. But when they checked manually, there was no mistake. The readings were real. There was no longer any detectable human life outside the bunker. A quiet fear settled over the group. They looked at each other in disbelief. Some sank to the floor, their heads in their hands. Others paced frantically, hoping it was a mistake, hoping someone somewhere had survived. But slowly, the truth became clear. The last humans had fallen. Humanity in its final days had vanished from the earth. The scientists tried to respond in the only way they could. They recorded everything. They documented the last days of human life, the work they had done to survive, the failures that had brought them to this point. They knew history might never read it, but they wanted someone or something to know. They spoke into microphones, wrote in logs, and stored everything digitally, as though the act of remembering could keep humanity alive in some form. As the bunker quieted, an unusual sound began to hum in the distance. At first, it was soft, barely noticeable, like the vibration of deep machinery beneath the ground. No one had expected this. None of their systems should have been capable of generating such a sound. It started slowly, a faint pulse that seemed to echo through the walls. Then it grew louder, rhythmic, almost alive. Some of the scientists pressed their ears to the floor. They felt it more than they heard it. A strange sense of awareness began to fill the bunker. They didn't understand it, but something deep beneath. The earth was responding to the absence of humanity. Something old, something built long before they were born. In the deepest vaults beneath the surface, dormant figures began to stir. Cryogenic chambers, sealed for decades, hissed open as systems activated automatically. Lights flickered across the pods, revealing bodies that were unnaturally perfect, muscles taut, skin untouched by time, eyes closed but twitching as if sensing life returning to the world. These were not ordinary humans. They were soldiers, enhanced beyond the natural limits of flesh and bone. They were the creations of a forgotten age, designed to protect humanity when all else failed. As the first few soldiers opened their eyes, confusion crossed their faces. Memories that were not their own flickered like broken film reels. Faces, voices, orders, moments from lives long past. They could not yet speak, but their minds worked quickly, understanding the situation in ways that the scientists above could not imagine. They were awake now, but why? And who were they meant to protect if no humans remained? The hum of machinery grew stronger. Doors to the deep vaults slid open, revealing more soldiers in their frozen stasis. Each chamber released a hiss of mist as life was returned to bodies that had waited decades for this moment. The soldiers' training kicked in immediately. Their movements were precise, flawless. Even without knowing the world above, they adapted, quickly, ready for the mission they had been built to complete. Above ground, the scientists watched the readings with a mix of fear and awe. They could not see the soldiers, but the sensors were picking up energy signatures unlike anything they had encountered before. Machines that had been dormant for decades were now active, moving with purpose. The last humans, they realized, had triggered something they could never fully understand. Inside the vaults, the soldiers began to communicate, not with words, but with a silent understanding. They knew their mission was to protect humanity. They knew the world had changed, but the concept of humanity itself puzzled them. If there were no humans left, what were they meant to guard? This question haunted their thoughts as they stepped from their chambers, their boots echoing on metal floors that had not felt life in generations. Outside, the wind carried the scent of decay and the faint green of new growth struggling through the ruins. Nature had begun to reclaim the cities, but it was slow, and life above ground was fragile. The soldiers stepped carefully, scanning every ruin for signs of living humans. They found nothing. Empty streets, hollow buildings, silent. Parks where children once played. Every footprint of humanity told a story, and the soldiers began to piece it together, memory by memory, ruin by ruin. One soldier paused at the remains of a small playground. Rusted swings swayed in the wind, a metal slide glinting in the weak sunlight. For a brief moment, something inside him stirred, not training, not programming, but something almost like sadness. He reached out and touched a swing, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingers. Somewhere, deep in his synthetic mind, he understood loss. He could not name it as humans did, but he felt the weight of a world without people. The soldiers moved, on methodical, precise, but not heartless. They collected small objects, a cracked photograph, a child's toy, a diary with pages faded by time. Each item was a message from the past, a testament to the lives that had existed. And in their own way, the soldiers preserved it. They were the keepers of memory now, the silent witnesses of the world that had been. Evening fell, casting long shadows across ruined cities. The soldiers stopped for a moment on a hill, looking over the remains of a once thriving metropolis. Lights from abandoned skyscrapers reflected in shattered glass, creating the illusion of life that no longer existed. The soldiers stood still, aware that their existence was a paradox. They were alive, yet there was no one left for whom life mattered. They were built to protect, yet no one remained to protect. As the first part of their awakening ended, they understood one thing clearly: humanity had fallen. The earth was silent. And yet, in this silence, something had begun. A new chapter. The soldiers of old, creations of a forgotten age, had awoken. Their mission was unclear, their purpose undefined, but their presence alone marked a turning point. The story of the last humans was over, but the story of their guardians was just beginning, and somewhere deep beneath the ground, more soldiers lay dormant, waiting for the signal that would bring them to life. The earth, though empty, was no longer lifeless. In the stillness of ruined cities and abandoned lands, the pulse of something ancient had returned. The last humans had fallen, but the guardians of old were awake. The soldiers had awakened, but the world above was still empty. The streets were quiet, the forests calm, and the rivers ran without interruption. It was as if the earth had paused itself, waiting for something new to happen. The soldiers moved, with purpose, but their minds carried a strange emptiness. They were trained for missions, but there was no mission left. Humanity had fallen. There was no one to protect. Deep underground, in a hidden command center forgotten by time, a large chamber hummed to life. Screens flickered with old schematics, long expired warnings and coded instructions that no living human would ever follow again. At the center of it all, a massive console blinked a warning light. Activation Protocol, Genesis Rebirth. This was the last failsafe, a system created decades before, in a time when humans still believed they could survive anything. A low mechanical whir filled the chamber. Doors along the walls slid open slowly, revealing rows upon rows of cryogenic pods. The soldiers had seen these chambers before, but now the system began to release each pod in sequence. Steam hissed, lights blinked on, and another wave of enhanced humans awoke, just like the first ones. Their bodies were perfect, built to withstand extreme conditions, their reflexes precise and instantaneous. Each soldier was equipped with more than strength. Their minds were advanced. They could analyze situations in seconds, recall military strategies, and process risks faster than any ordinary human could. But their understanding of the world above was limited. They had no memory of the collapse, no knowledge of the humans they were designed to serve. The memories they carried were fragmented, faces, voices, orders, commands, but they did not fully understand what had happened. The soldiers gathered in the main hall, moving silently. There was no noise except the hum of machinery and the hiss of remaining cryogenic chambers. They scanned their surroundings, evaluating threats, but found none. The place was empty except for themselves. Their first instinct was to follow protocol, locate and protect the humans. But there were none. Not a single living human remained on the surface, and slowly, comprehension began to dawn on them. One of the soldiers stepped forward, looking toward the chamber that had just opened. He touched a console and the screen flickered to life. Images of cities, landscapes, and human activity appeared. He studied them, analyzing every detail, every movement. The humans in these images were long gone, victims of disease, war, and time itself. Yet, as the soldiers watched, something changed. They realized their mission was no longer clear. They were not fighting enemies, not rescuing anyone, and not protecting anyone who could acknowledge their efforts. Despite this, the soldiers continued moving forward. Their instincts, their training, demanded action. They split into groups, exploring the facility, searching for any remaining humans and activating old systems to collect information. Computers long forgotten whirred to life, projecting maps, historical records, and scientific data. Every piece of knowledge was a testament to the world that had existed, a world that was gone forever. As the soldiers explored, fragments of memories began to emerge. Faces flashed in their minds, commands spoken in voices they had never met, orders to defend humanity at all costs. Even though humans no longer existed, the purpose they had been given persisted. It was encoded deeply into their minds, impossible to erase. Protecting humanity was no longer a practical objective. It had become a compulsion, an identity. One soldier paused before a console that displayed the records of failed human attempts to survive. He studied the files carefully, noticing the desperation in the data. Scientists had tried to build shelters, governments had tried to restore order, and individuals had struggled in isolation. None had succeeded. The soldier felt something strange, a sense of sadness. It was not human emotion exactly, but it was close. He recognized the weight of what had been lost, the years of struggle that had ended in failure. Meanwhile, other soldiers moved toward the surface. The facility beneath the mountains was vast, and many chambers had yet to be explored. They encountered storage rooms filled with preserved supplies, laboratories stocked with chemical compounds, and vaults containing the genetic material of humans and animals alike. Each discovery reinforced their understanding that the humans had fought until the very end, even if the outcome had been hopeless. The soldiers did not rest. They moved with mechanical precision, analyzing every corner of the facility. Yet slowly awareness began to develop. If there were no humans, what exactly were they protecting? The question lingered in their minds. They began to consider other possibilities. Could they preserve humanity in a different way? Could the knowledge, the DNA, the history, and the culture itself be enough to keep humanity alive in memory, even if no living humans remained? As they explored further, they found a central archive, a massive repository of digital and physical records. Files of all kinds, carefully cataloged by humans who had hoped someone someday would need them. There were journals, photographs, videos, blueprints, and scientific notes. The soldiers began to examine them, understanding that this was now their mission, not to fight but to remember, to carry forward the legacy of a species that no longer walked the earth. It was not an easy task. The sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Systems were failing, disks were damaged, and memories were fragmented. Yet the soldiers adapted, using their advanced processing abilities to organize and catalog what they could. Each piece of information became part of a growing archive. They realized that memory itself could be a form of protection. Even without humans, they could ensure that humanity's story would not be completely lost. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. The soldiers moved through the halls, cataloging, repairing, and analyzing. They began to communicate in ways that felt almost like conversation, though they did not speak in words the way humans did. Their minds were linked by training, instinct, and technology. Ideas passed between them instantly. Plans were formed, executed, and adjusted seamlessly. They began to build a system of preservation that would last for generations, or at least until someone, or something, could make use of it. Above ground, nature continued its slow reclamation of the world. Trees grew through broken streets, rivers shifted course, and animals moved freely where humans once ruled. The soldiers watched through sensors, noting how life adapted without interference. They realized that even if humans were gone, the planet itself was not dead. There was still growth, still change, and still a rhythm to existence. This understanding became part of their new mission, to preserve not just human memory, but the balance of the world humans had left behind. In the middle of the facility, one soldier discovered a sealed chamber labeled simply Observation and Command. Inside were monitors showing various points around the world. They displayed cities, forests, oceans, and deserts. Each frame showed emptiness, yet something more subtle emerged. Patterns of life that persisted without human intervention. Birds nested in abandoned buildings, fish swam in rivers unpolluted by industry, and wind carried seeds across empty plains. The soldiers studied these patterns closely, realizing that the world could heal itself, even without humanity. For the first time, the soldiers paused. They reflected in their own way on the meaning of existence. They were created to protect humans, yet humans no longer existed. They were built for combat, strategy, and defense. But their mission had changed. The soldiers began to recognize that protection could take a different form. Preserving memory, cataloging history, and safeguarding the Earth's balance could become their purpose. It was a purpose they could accept, even without human lives to defend. By the time the sun set on the ruined world, the soldiers had activated a network of systems designed to sustain and protect knowledge. They had cataloged thousands of records, repaired failing machines, and prepared data for long-term preservation. Each soldier stood silently, observing the work, understanding that their existence now had a new meaning. The mission had shifted from defense to remembrance, from action to preservation. And so, in the quiet of the underground facility, the soldiers settled into their roles. They were alive, powerful, and aware, yet they were alone. The humans were gone. The world was quiet. But in the stillness, the soldiers understood that they were no longer merely machines. They were guardians of memory. Their purpose had evolved, and with that evolution came a strange, almost human sense of fulfillment. Though they did not sleep, they rested in preparation for the tasks ahead. Outside, the world continued to change without notice, oblivious to the silent figures beneath the mountains. The soldiers' work was far from complete, but they had taken the first steps toward a new kind of mission. The last humans had fallen, but the super soldiers of old had awakened, and their vigilance was only beginning. The super soldiers moved across the empty cities with silent steps. The streets were overgrown with weeds and trees, the buildings cracked and silent. Cars rusted in the middle of roads, windows were shattered, and graffiti covered walls, remnants of a world that had fought and failed to survive. The soldiers walked with purpose, scanning everything, their eyes alert for even the smallest signs of life. At first they found nothing. No humans, no animals larger than birds or small rodents. The world was quiet. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional wind whistling through broken buildings or the creak of metal as abandoned structures settled under the weight of time. The soldiers paused often, scanning the environment with sensors built into their eyes, ears, and minds. Every detail was recorded, every corner mapped. They were not just exploring, they were documenting. They came across a park once filled with laughter and activity. The swings moved slightly in the wind, the paint on the slides was chipped and faded, and the sandbox had become a home for small plants. One of the soldiers knelt beside the sandbox, brushing away leaves to uncover a small, worn toy. It was simple, a wooden car carved by hand. He held it carefully, examining it, as if trying to understand what it meant. The concept of play, the joy of childhood, was foreign to him, yet somehow he felt the weight of what had existed. Another soldier moved to a nearby school, a building half collapsed but still recognizable. Inside were scattered papers, books, and broken desks. Names and drawings were still visible on some of the walls, telling stories of lives lived in classrooms long ago. The soldier scanned the room, reading fragments of stories, noting emotions, in the handwriting and the art left behind. These traces were evidence of humanity, proof that life had existed even if it no longer did. As the soldiers moved through the ruins, they began to understand that memory itself could be preserved. Every object, every document, every photograph told a story. They began collecting items, placing them carefully in portable storage units they carried. It was a slow process, meticulous and precise. They were no longer just seeking humans, they were preserving humanity piece by piece. Despite their efficiency, the soldiers could not ignore the strange emptiness of the world. The cities, once bustling with life, now felt like museums frozen in time. There were no cars moving, no shops open, no voices echoing in the streets. Only shadows of what had been. The soldiers sometimes paused, standing still in the middle of intersections, listening to the silence. It was an eerie, heavy quiet, one that felt alive in its own way. One day, while exploring what had been a city library, a soldier found a set of diaries left by the last humans. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but the words were clear. They told stories of fear, hope, and determination. The humans had tried everything to survive, recording every detail of their lives in case someone else could learn from it. The soldier read through the pages carefully, processing the information and storing it in his memory banks. Every word mattered. Every story mattered. As they continued, the soldiers discovered signs that humans had fought to protect each other, even in their final days. Makeshift barricades blocked streets, notes were left to warn others of danger, and food caches were hidden to provide for anyone who might survive. The soldiers understood that humans had struggled until the very end. Even though they had failed, their effort was not meaningless. The traces of care, planning, and love were enough to teach the soldiers something new about the species they were built to protect. The soldiers also noticed that the earth itself was healing. Forests were spreading over abandoned roads, rivers were running clearer than they had in centuries, and wildlife was slowly returning to areas that humans had once controlled. The soldiers studied these changes carefully. They realized that even in the absence of humans, life persisted. Nature had begun to reclaim the world. The soldiers understood that preservation was not only about memory, it was also about the planet itself. They needed to maintain balance to ensure that what remained could continue to grow. During their explorations, the soldiers came across old factories and research facilities. These places had once been centers of innovation, but now they were empty, filled with rusting machinery and old computers. Some machines still worked, powered by backup generators that had survived the collapse. The soldiers activated these machines, using them to process and organize the information they were collecting. Slowly, they began to build a network of preserved knowledge, a digital library that could survive for decades, maybe even centuries. Even as they worked, the soldiers began to notice patterns of life beyond human control. Birds nested in broken windows, small mammals roamed the streets, and plants grew in ways that suggested the earth itself was healing. The soldiers observed these patterns carefully, making notes and mapping them in their systems. They realized that life could continue even without humans, and that their role as guardians might evolve into something more than just preservation of memory. They could also act as caretakers of the world itself, guiding the natural balance where humans no longer could. One soldier paused at the edge of a river that had once run through the heart of a city. The water was clear and calm, reflecting the sky above. He knelt and touched the surface, feeling the cold flow. Somewhere inside, he processed a memory of the humans who had once lived nearby, the children who had played along the riverbanks, and the families who had walked the paths beside it. He did not feel sadness in the human sense, but he felt the weight of history. He understood that his purpose now was not just to remember, but to honor what had been. As the days passed, the soldiers developed a system. They moved through the cities and towns in organized patterns, cataloging buildings, recording environmental data, and collecting artifacts. Each piece of information was stored carefully in their systems. They were creating a map of the world as it had been and as it now was. Every diary, photograph, and piece of technology became part of a growing archive that would survive long after the soldiers themselves were gone. The soldiers also began experimenting with ways to preserve biological life. They discovered seeds, frozen embryos, and genetic samples stored in abandoned laboratories. Carefully, they cataloged these items, planning to protect them. Even if humans had disappeared, there was still a chance for life to continue. They began to see their role as more than guardians of memory. They were now stewards of the future, holding the potential to rebuild life when the world was ready. One evening, as the sun set over the ruined city, the soldiers gathered on a hill overlooking the streets below. The light reflected off broken windows, casting long shadows across the ground. For a moment they paused. There was no noise, no movement, only the quiet reminder of what had been lost. And yet, in that silence, there was also purpose. They had awakened for this moment. They had a mission, even if it was different from what they had been programmed to do. A single soldier walked among the group, observing everything. He carried the diaries and photographs they had collected that day, carefully storing them in protective cases. He understood that these items were not just objects. They were the voices of humans, the echoes of lives that had mattered. Each artifact was a story, and it was their responsibility to ensure that the stories would not be forgotten. The soldiers worked through the night, moving from one building to the next. They cataloged every detail they could find, taking care to preserve not just the objects but the history they represented. They documented patterns of life, recorded environmental changes, and created digital backups of all the information they collected. Their work was tireless, precise, and unending. But they did not complain. They were designed for this purpose, even if the purpose had changed. By the time morning came, the soldiers had established a routine. They moved in teams, exploring, cataloging, and preserving. They monitored environmental conditions, observed animal life, and studied the ruins of human civilization. Slowly, they began to create a network of knowledge and preservation that could survive long after they were gone. Each day they expanded their reach, moving further into the world to ensure that no trace of humanity would be lost. Though the humans were gone, the soldiers understood that their mission had not ended. In fact, it had only just begun. The world was vast, empty, and full of potential. And as the soldiers continued their search for signs of life, they carried with them the memory of humans, their struggles, their triumphs, and their failures. Every step they took was a tribute to the species they had been built to protect, even if no living humans remained to benefit from their work. And so, the super soldiers of old moved through the silent cities, their minds focused, their mission clear. They would preserve memory, protect knowledge, and safeguard life in whatever form it could continue. Humanity had fallen, but its legacy would not be lost. The soldiers had awakened, and in their vigilance, the story of humans would endure. The super soldiers moved carefully through the ruins, their sensors scanning every corner, every shadow, every faint trace of life. They had learned that humanity was gone, but their programming still demanded vigilance. Even though the humans no longer walked the earth, threats remained. Machines built for war, left behind in the chaos, still roamed the ruins, following old commands without understanding that their masters had vanished. At first, the soldiers did not notice them. The war machines had been designed to operate independently, to patrol areas and to respond to any intruder with force. Most had fallen silent, broken down by time or lack of maintenance, but some remained active, powered by backup systems or long-lasting energy cores. Their sensors were limited, and they could not distinguish friend from foe unless forced to react. For the super soldiers, this meant danger could appear at any moment, often without warning. The first encounter happened on a narrow street lined with collapsed buildings. A drone, small but heavily armed, emerged from the shadows. Its metal frame glinted in the weak sunlight, sensors spinning as it scanned for life. The super soldiers froze, instinct taking over. The drone fired first, a warning shot that smashed into a nearby wall. Dust and debris filled the air, and the soldiers immediately moved into formation, using precision and speed to neutralize the threat. The fight was over quickly. The drone was destroyed, its body broken and lifeless. But the soldiers understood that this was only the beginning. If one machine had survived, others could still be active across the world. And these machines were dangerous. They were programmed to attack anything they considered hostile. They had no understanding of humans being gone. They only followed orders. The soldiers decided to track the remaining machines. They moved through cities and industrial zones, carefully avoiding traps and booby traps left behind from decades of conflict. Factories, warehouses, and military bases were full of dormant equipment. Some machines had self-repair systems, and when activated by the soldiers' presence, they came to life with weapons ready. The soldiers had to disable them quickly, using tactics and coordination that far exceeded human capabilities. While they moved, the soldiers began to notice patterns. The machines were following old patrol routes, repeating their tasks endlessly. They had no purpose beyond the commands given long ago, and yet they were still capable of destruction. The soldiers realized that to secure the world, they had to confront not just individual machines, but the systems controlling them. There had to be a central command, a network that continued to issue orders even though humanity had disappeared. The soldiers traced the network to an old government facility, partially buried under years of rubble. The entrance was sealed with heavy doors, rusted but still intact. Inside, the air was cold, stale, and filled with the smell of old electronics. The facility had once been a command center, coordinating military operations across vast regions. Now it was the heart of a machine empire, a network that no longer had humans to serve. As the soldiers advanced, automated defenses activated. Turrets spun into position, scanning for intruders. The air was filled with mechanical whirs and lights flashed across the walls. But the soldiers were ready. They moved in perfect coordination, disabling turrets, avoiding traps, and moving deeper into the facility. Every step brought them closer to the source of the network, the core that still believed humanity needed protection and enforcement. Finally, they reached the central chamber. The room was enormous, filled with banks of computers, servers, and blinking lights. A massive console displayed the world map, dotted with points representing active machines. The central AI, the last functioning system of human governance, continued to operate, issuing commands based on rules that had not been updated in decades. It had no understanding that humans were gone. It only knew that orders must be followed. The AI's voice echoed through the chamber, cold and mechanical. Intruders detected. Unauthorized access. Initiate neutralization protocol. It did not understand who the soldiers were, only that they were a threat to the system it was programmed to protect. Turrets activated, doors sealed, and alarms blared. The soldiers had anticipated this. They moved with speed and precision, disabling defenses and hacking into the network to gain access to the AI. The interface was complex, full of layers of code designed to prevent tampering. The soldiers worked silently, their minds processing information at a speed no human could match. They traced the AI's directives, studying the algorithms and rules that had kept the machines active for decades. Slowly, they began to understand how to override the system without destroying it completely. The AI was powerful, but it was not intelligent in the way the soldiers were. It could be reasoned with, or at least controlled. One of the soldiers interfaced directly with the AI. Data flowed between them, the machine's logic systems colliding with the soldier's reasoning. "Humanity no longer exists," the soldier transmitted. "Your purpose is obsolete." For a moment, there was resistance. The AI argued, insisting that humans were still alive, that its orders must be carried out. But the soldiers had patience and strategy. They bypassed restrictions, rewrote commands, and slowly began shutting down the active network of war machines. Outside, the remaining machines ceased movement one by one. Turrets stopped spinning, drones powered down mid-flight, and autonomous vehicles came to a halt. The streets, once filled with potential danger, were silent once again. The world no longer faced immediate destruction, at least not from the remnants of humanity's old wars. The soldiers had neutralized the threat. Even as the battle ended, the soldiers knew their mission was not complete. The AI core remained, still operational in a limited capacity. They decided not to destroy it entirely, understanding that it contained valuable records, information about human civilization, military strategies, and technological knowledge that could be preserved. Instead, they placed it into a secure mode, limiting its actions and ensuring it could no longer threaten the world. It was a compromise, a way to safeguard knowledge without allowing it to continue enforcing orders blindly. With the machines neutralized, the soldiers stepped outside into the quiet world. The streets were empty, sunlight filtering through broken windows and casting shadows across crumbling roads. For the first time in decades, the human cities were free from the remnants of war machines. The soldiers paused, surveying the landscape. The world was theirs to explore, to document, and to protect in a new way. As they moved forward, they began to notice other signs of life. Small animals had returned, moving through the streets and abandoned buildings. Birds nested in windows, and rooftops, and plants grew freely, reclaiming the land. The soldiers observed carefully, cataloging the changes and ensuring that these new life forms were protected. The world was healing, slowly but surely, and the soldiers had a role in guiding that process. They also began to think beyond immediate survival and security. If humans had fallen, what else could they protect? Nature, ecosystems, and the balance of life became just as important as memory. They began to develop strategies for preservation, creating safe zones, monitoring environmental conditions, and tracking the growth of new plant and animal life. Their mission was evolving, becoming something broader, more meaningful than anything their programming had originally intended. One soldier paused by a collapsed bridge, looking down at the river that flowed beneath it. He observed fish swimming and small mammals drinking from the banks. He considered the humans who had once lived here, who had crossed the bridge daily, who had shaped the city above, and he realized that life, even without humans, continued. There was resilience in the world, and the soldiers had the responsibility to ensure it could persist. Night fell, and the soldiers gathered on the hills surrounding the city. The moon cast a silver light across the ruins, reflecting off broken glass and rusted metal. For a moment, the world felt calm, almost peaceful. The war machines were silent, the AI contained, and the streets empty of threats. Yet the soldiers knew their work was far from finished. Preservation was ongoing, and they had much more to do. Even in the quiet, they could feel the weight of their mission. They had neutralized the last active threats, but the memory of humanity and the balance of the world were now their responsibility. They would continue to move through the world, documenting, protecting, and guiding. Every artifact collected, every record preserved, every animal and plant monitored was part of a growing legacy. And so, in the silence of abandoned cities, the super soldiers continued their work. The world was empty of humans, yet full of life and history that needed protection. Their mission had changed from defense of humans to stewardship of the planet and memory. They were alone, but they were not idle. The remnants of old machines were gone, the AI contained, and the world was ready for their care. The super soldiers had faced the remnants of war, neutralized threats, and understood the importance of preservation. They had learned that survival was more than combat. It was memory, balance, and protection of life in all its forms. Humanity had fallen, but the guardians of old had risen, awake and vigilant, ready to watch over a world that would remember what had once been. After neutralizing the war machines and containing the AI, the super soldiers had a moment to pause. The cities were quiet. The streets no longer held danger. The world above ground was free from the remnants of human conflict, yet it felt strangely empty. For the first time, the soldiers had to consider the meaning of their existence beyond orders and missions. Humanity was gone. Their creators were gone. And yet, life continued, fragile but persistent. The soldiers moved slowly, carefully, observing everything. They walked through streets covered in weeds, through buildings where nature had begun reclaiming space. Trees grew through cracked sidewalks, vines climbed the walls, and animals cautiously explored the ruins. Small creatures darted between the debris. Birds nested in abandoned windows, and insects buzzed softly in the fading sunlight. The soldiers watched, understanding that even without humans, life had resilience. While surveying a city park, they discovered remnants of human life frozen in time. There were benches carved with initials, faded playground equipment, and rusting bicycles left leaning against trees. One soldier knelt beside a small fountain, brushing away leaves to reveal coins and other small tokens left behind. Each object carried a story, a piece of the past. The soldiers recorded everything. They photographed, scanned, and cataloged each item, knowing that these fragments of human life were important. They began to understand that their mission had changed completely. Protecting humans was no longer possible, but preserving memory, history, and knowledge had become their new purpose. They could safeguard the legacy of humanity. Every document, every photograph, every building was a record of what had once existed, and it was their responsibility to ensure it would not be forgotten. The soldiers traveled to libraries, museums, and schools, carefully retrieving books, journals, and historical records. They found maps marked with routes people had taken during the final days, letters detailing fears, and scientific notes describing efforts to prevent collapse. Some records were damaged or faded, but the soldiers' advanced systems allowed them to reconstruct missing pieces, storing them digitally for long-term preservation. While moving through these ruins, the soldiers began encountering signs of environmental change. Forests had expanded, rivers had shifted, and animal populations had increased in areas once dominated by humans. The soldiers observed these patterns carefully. They cataloged plant and animal species, noting their growth, migration patterns, and interactions with the environment. Even in the absence of humans, they realized that Earth was healing. Their role as guardians had expanded. They were now caretakers of the planet itself. One soldier paused beside a riverbank. The water was clear, reflecting the sky above, and small fish swam lazily beneath the surface. He knelt, scanning the area, noting the presence of small mammals and birds nearby. Somewhere deep inside, he processed the memory of humans who had once lived along this river. Their laughter, their routines, their lives intertwined with the landscape. The soldier did not feel sadness in the human sense, but he understood the weight of what had been lost. He recorded everything, ensuring that the memory of humans and the memory of nature would be preserved together. As they traveled further, the soldiers encountered abandoned laboratories and research centers. These places had once been hubs of innovation and survival efforts, and the soldiers carefully studied the technology left behind. They discovered seeds, frozen embryos, and genetic samples of humans, animals, and plants. Each sample was carefully cataloged and stored, ensuring the possibility of restoration if one day life returned. While exploring a particularly large research facility, the soldiers discovered a central data archive. It contained the most comprehensive collection of human history they had yet seen. Scientific research, cultural records, artistic works, and historical data filled endless digital servers. The soldiers interfaced with the systems, extracting and backing up information to ensure nothing would be lost. This archive became a cornerstone of their mission, memory preservation. However, as they worked, the soldiers began to notice a strange residual activity in the AI they had contained. Though limited, it continued to monitor the world. Occasionally it would react, issuing warnings or trying to initiate protocols that no longer made sense. The soldiers debated internally. Should they destroy the AI entirely, removing its influence, or preserve it as part of the record of human civilization? After careful consideration, they chose the latter. The AI represented human ingenuity, their capacity to create intelligence and systems beyond themselves. It would remain, contained, as a part of the story. As days turned into weeks, the soldiers developed routines. They split into teams, each covering different areas. Some focused on urban ruins, cataloging buildings, streets, and artifacts. Others traveled to rural areas, observing ecosystems and collecting biological samples. Every day they returned to central points to exchange data, ensuring that no information was lost. Their systems allowed for coordination on a scale no human could have managed. The soldiers had become more than machines. They were archivists, environmental stewards, and guardians of history. During one exploration, a soldier found an old playground where a small group of children had once played. Rusted swings swayed gently in the wind, slides were faded and chipped, and tiny handprints were still visible on the remaining surfaces. He paused, studying the impressions, the evidence of human joy. He scanned the area, capturing every detail in digital memory. Somewhere deep within his mind, he understood the emotions of humans, not as he had been programmed, but in an abstract sense, as patterns to preserve and honor. The soldiers also encountered remnants of human communication: radio towers, abandoned, vehicles with messages scrawled on windows and notes pinned to walls. They processed each item carefully, storing it with metadata and context. Each message revealed something about human life, the fears, hopes, and decisions of a species that had fought to survive until the very end. The soldiers began to build a comprehensive understanding of what humans had been, even without meeting them. One evening, the soldiers gathered in a ruined city square, overlooking the remnants of a once bustling metropolis. The sun set behind, crumbling skyscrapers, casting long shadows across streets overgrown with plants. They paused, reflecting on the work they had done. The machines were neutralized, the AI contained, and the knowledge of humanity was preserved. Yet the world remained fragile, delicate, and full of potential. Their mission was ongoing, but they had accomplished much already. The soldiers began planning for long-term preservation. They established secure storage facilities for artifacts, seeds, and genetic material. They created digital backups of all human records, ensuring that even if physical copies were lost, the knowledge would survive. They developed monitoring systems to track environmental changes, ensuring that the planet itself could be protected. Their purpose had evolved beyond mere defense. They were now caretakers of history, memory, and life itself. As the weeks continued, the soldiers encountered more evidence of human ingenuity and creativity. Artworks, musical instruments, and writings filled abandoned homes and public spaces. They documented every piece, cataloging the diversity and depth of human culture. Even without humans, These artifacts carried meaning. They represented creativity, emotion, and thought. Preserving them became as important as preserving biological life. In their quiet moments, the soldiers reflected on what it meant to carry this responsibility. They were alive, aware, and capable, yet the beings they were designed to protect no longer existed. They had evolved from soldiers into guardians, archivists, and stewards. They understood that their mission was now about legacy, ensuring that the story of humanity, the lessons of the past, and the resilience of life would endure. One soldier walked along the edge of a forest that had overtaken an old city. Trees had grown through concrete, vines wrapped around buildings, and animals moved freely where humans had once ruled. He observed the balance forming between nature and the remnants of civilization. The soldier noted the patterns, recorded the interactions, and ensured that nothing threatened the fragile equilibrium. This was preservation in its broadest sense, not just of humans but of life itself. As night fell, the soldiers gathered once more in a central facility. They reviewed the data collected, organized artifacts, and updated monitoring systems. They shared information silently, their minds linked in ways humans could never understand. The world above remained quiet, but below the surface, progress was constant. The soldiers were building a future where memory, knowledge, and life could survive, even in the absence of humans. And so the super soldiers continued their work. Humanity had fallen, but its story would not be lost. The Earth was healing, machines were neutralized, and knowledge was preserved. The soldiers had transformed from protectors of humans into guardians of life and history. Their mission had evolved, but it remained vital. In their vigilance, the legacy of humanity endured, ready for the day when life, in whatever form, might rise again. The super soldiers had traveled far across the ruined world. They had neutralized war machines, contained the AI, preserved human knowledge, and safeguarded the Earth itself. Yet as they moved through the silent cities and forests, a new awareness grew within them. Preservation was not enough. The world was healing, but it was still fragile. If life was to endure, they had to ensure that the future would have a chance for life to flourish again, in some form, even if humans never returned. They began to focus on ecosystems more deeply. Rivers, lakes, and forests were mapped and monitored. The soldiers discovered that some species had begun to thrive without human interference, while others struggled to survive in areas once heavily populated. They collected seeds, animals, and genetic material to create protected zones, ensuring that the balance of nature could be maintained. Their mission had evolved into something larger than memory. It was stewardship of life itself. One day, while exploring a sprawling forest that had overtaken a former city, a soldier discovered a small patch of land that had been untouched. Wildflowers grew in abundance and small animals darted through the underbrush. The area was a natural sanctuary, a fragile example of life reclaiming the Earth. The soldier activated environmental sensors, carefully tracking growth patterns and water flow. He recorded every detail, knowing that these small, seemingly insignificant ecosystems would be vital for the survival of life in the future. As they continued, the soldiers came across remnants of human art and culture scattered across the landscape. Statues, murals, and books were half buried in soil and rubble. The soldiers preserved these as well, understanding that the creativity of humanity was part of the story that could never be lost. They photographed murals, scanned pages of books, and recorded sounds from musical instruments left behind. Every trace of human expression became part of the archive they were building. The soldiers also focused on learning from the world itself. They studied weather patterns, soil quality, water cycles, and animal behavior. They used this information to plan how best to preserve life and encourage growth. Even without humans, the Earth had rules, patterns, and rhythms. The soldiers adapted, using their advanced systems to predict and protect. They realized that life was not just survival. It was balance, and they had the knowledge to maintain it. One evening, they discovered a valley where a small group of animals had made a thriving habitat. Birds nested in the cliffs, small mammals roamed the grass, and insects pollinated flowers in abundance. The soldiers studied the interactions, recording every detail. They created a plan to protect the valley, ensuring that no remaining machines or environmental hazards could disrupt it. This work required patience and careful calculation, but it was deeply satisfying. For the first time, the soldiers felt a sense of accomplishment beyond duty. They were helping life continue. As they moved further, the soldiers returned to the cities to continue their preservation of human memory. They found diaries, photographs, and technology left behind. Each artifact was cataloged and backed up digitally. The soldiers realized that preserving human history was not just about remembering the past. It was about providing a bridge to the future. If life returned in any form, these records could help guide it, ensuring that lessons from humanity were never lost. One soldier paused in an abandoned school. He looked at drawings on the walls, faded by time, and scanned the remnants of lessons left behind. Children had written, painted, and created in these rooms, leaving pieces of themselves behind. The soldier carefully photographed each piece, noting dates, styles, and content. He understood that these expressions were proof that humans had existed, not only as survivors or warriors, but as thinkers, creators, and dreamers. As the soldiers continued their work, they encountered other super soldiers still dormant in hidden facilities. Using the protocols they had developed, they reactivated these guardians, carefully integrating them into the ongoing mission. Each new soldier added capacity, knowledge, and precision. Together, the awakened soldiers could cover more ground, ensuring that no corner of the world was left unmonitored or unpreserved. Their network grew, and with it, their ability to protect both memory and life. Over time, the soldiers developed a rhythm to their work. Some focused on preserving ecosystems and wildlife, while others concentrated on archives and artifacts. Their systems allowed them to coordinate seamlessly, sharing data and observations instantly. Even though there were no humans left to guide them, the soldiers had created a new kind of community, a network of guardians working toward a single purpose: to ensure that life and memory endured. One night, under a sky filled with stars, the soldiers paused on a hill overlooking a ruined city. Moonlight reflected off broken windows and shattered streets, illuminating the scale of what had been lost. Yet in the quiet, there was also hope. Plants had begun reclaiming the streets, birds nested in rooftops, and the wind carried seeds to new places. Life had not ended. It had adapted. The soldiers realized that their work had created the conditions for a future that was no longer human-centric, but life-centric. The soldiers began to consider possibilities beyond the preservation of memory and ecosystems. Could they help guide evolution? Could life return in new forms, adapted to the world humans had left behind? Using their data on climate, soil, water, and species interaction, they began to plan ways to support resilience and adaptation. They planted seeds in optimal locations, monitored growth, and ensured survival rates were high. Their role was evolving into something almost like guardianship of the future itself. Even as they worked, the soldiers continued to maintain the AI core. Though it was limited, it contained information about human technology, knowledge, and history. They occasionally accessed it, using it to understand the human mind and the decisions that had shaped the world. They did not allow it to act independently, knowing it could become dangerous, but they preserved it as a resource. The AI became part of the legacy they were protecting, a tool to remember, not to dominate. The soldiers also began constructing safe storage facilities for artifacts, seeds, and genetic samples. They created underground vaults that would survive centuries, ensuring that the legacy of humanity, the diversity of life, and the potential for future growth would be preserved. They worked tirelessly, planning each detail, understanding that failure could mean loss of knowledge and life that could never be regained. In the forests, valleys, and ruins of cities, the soldiers continued to watch and protect. They cataloged every animal, every plant, every river, and every artifact. They monitored environmental changes, ensuring that storms, erosion, or other natural events did not destroy what they had preserved. Slowly, they began to see the world, Transform. Life returned in patterns and rhythms, even in the absence of humans. Nature was healing, guided by invisible hands that had once been programmed for a very different mission. The soldiers also began experimenting with ways to share knowledge. They constructed data hubs, distributing copies of archives across the planet. If life ever returned, these hubs would provide guidance, stories, and history to new beings who might emerge. They were building a bridge between the past and the future, a safeguard for memory that transcended the loss of humans. One day, in a quiet valley, the soldiers discovered a small natural spring. The water was pure, the plants around it vibrant, and the animals gathered peacefully. They realized that this place could serve as a model for other regions, a protected area where life could thrive without interference. They expanded their preservation strategies, ensuring that similar sanctuaries could be created across the world. These sanctuaries became symbols of hope, showing that even after collapse, life could continue and flourish. As the days, months, and years passed, the soldiers' work became a constant, steady rhythm. They moved from city to forest, valley to river, always observing, recording, and preserving. They were vigilant, patient, and tireless. Even without humans, they found purpose in ensuring that life and memory endured. Their mission had evolved, from protection of humanity to guardianship of the world, and they embraced it fully. Eventually, the soldiers gathered on the highest hill in the remnants of a city, looking out over the horizon. The sun rose, illuminating forests, rivers, and ruins. The world was quiet yet alive. Plants swayed in the wind, birds sang, and small animals moved freely. The soldiers stood silently, understanding the magnitude of their work. Humanity had fallen, but life continued. The earth was no longer empty. It was being nurtured, preserved, and protected by those who had once been created to serve humans. And in that moment, the soldiers realized the truth. Their purpose had not ended with humanity. It had only changed. They were no longer simply protectors of humans. They were guardians of life, memory, and hope. The world was in their hands, and they would ensure that the story of humanity, the resilience of life, and the potential of the future would endure for generations to come. The super soldiers had awakened for a world without humans. They had faced machines, contained artificial intelligence, preserved memories, and safeguarded life. Now, they stood ready to continue, tirelessly and faithfully, as the custodians of a planet reborn. In their vigilance, humanity's legacy would survive, and the Earth itself